Sorshel will let us know when we're live. We're live, okay.
Hello again. So this is the second half of the meeting for the Renewable Energy Standard Working Group. And again, today is Wednesday, November 1st, 2023, and it's 10:15.
Thereabouts. So here's the suggested,
10:18.
yeah, suggested order of events. Just have a quick math correction type announcement from this morning's discussion. And then my suggestion is that tier one questions in this poll, you've discussed a lot of them. You've covered an awful lot of that ground between last meeting and this. There's 7, 8, 9 that you're just walking out of that discussion now. And then questions 10 and 11 were about RECs and unbundled RECs, which you discussed last week and sort of reframed into what is the right level of new renewables in Vermont and what counts as a new renewable or what counts as renewable. So my suggestion is that we shift immediately to tier 2 questions and tier 3 so you get a sense of what was there in the poll results and get to talk about them a bit. There may still be time for a brief break before public comment, but we are pushing the timeline a little bit. So that will probably be very, very brief, 5 minutes. So TJ, math correction?
Yeah, thank you. And I want to apologize for doing math on the fly may not be the best thing, but and thank Ben for calling me on it. The total, I had a formula error in the spreadsheet. And so the total amount of nuclear contract purchases for contracts is 742,000 megawatt hours. And so times $5 a REC would be roughly $3.25 million per year. That would be to be covered with renewable energy credits. So I said 17 million this morning, and that was well off. And I am a little embarrassed to correct that now, but I did want to get that on the record, the correct number. So I think that the trade-off is still, the point on the trade-offs is still relevant, but the dollar amount is different.
Is there any reservation about moving to the tier 2 questions? Does anybody else have anything else they want to say about the tier 1 poll results before we move there? Okay, so I'm going to pull up on my screen the results to tier 2 questions 12 through 14. You'll see one at a time. If you are looking at, if you want to find the collated the results of this survey, they're now posted under the PDF of the slides was posted on the resource page for this working group. But now the Word document is, so if you wanted to be seeing people's comments, it might be a little easier to see them there. Just go to the legislative working group webpage and you'll see it posted. I'll also share my screen with the question that we're on. Should the percentage of distributed renewable energy change and to what? And then should the current list of tier 2 eligible resources change? There's a lot of folks who skipped this question 12. 4 said percent should not change. If you answered yes, there were several comments. That's where your conversation will go, just the brief generally. If you look at those comments, a couple of points that came up, to expanding those eligible resources to include some version of low impact hydro, add projects that are greater than 5 megawatts, and the 2010 dates, and revised net metering rules. Another note about no new wood biomass. And comments around eliminating tier 2 or stepping away from fixed percentages. Again, around flexibility to meet affordability and reliability goals. There were several different comments. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can see each other's faces and you can see the room. But if you want to look at the document, you can find them on the working group webpage. What questions do you have of each other based on these results or what you see in the comments? You may also have questions about content or about the current energy standard legislation. So I didn't introduce you to the table before, but Ellen, thank you, as legislative counsel, and TJ is also going to sit at the table in case there's a content question related to the analysis. If you have a question of each other around tier 2, you can raise your hand to let me know. I'm going to go Senator Bray and then William, and we'll see who else has comments after that.
Yeah, so I'm interested to hear what the group's thoughts are around tier 2, which has a 5 megawatt generation cap on it now, to raising that cap to a higher.
I'd advocate for increasing the size of the cap. I know particularly for our location, very, very limited service territory, about 700 acres. And if we want to site some solar on our campus, there's potentially a limit in the way we read the current res. We feel, across the size of our campus, different locations within the campus, we have potential to add 20 to 25 megawatts of solar. Different locations, different areas, and just lack of clarity right now on how those would be treated, in the ability to allow them to be all greater than 5 megawatts and rule out that question of how they would be treated would be helpful. In general, I would assume that across the state that an increase to greater than 5 megawatts would help with economies of scale as far as adding renewables at a lowest cost.
Do you want to repeat your question in case there are other answers?
Yeah, I'm happy to hear from anyone. I'm just follow on what Jeff just said. Standard offer has ended, and so it's like, what opportunities are there for development of renewables, and to what degree do we enable or constrain them by having the 5 megawatt cap, and what are the pros and cons of it? I think I'm asking myself as we think about the design going forward.
I would be fine with raising the cap. I also think the larger net metering project should be in that tier 2 or successor to standard offer system, not net metering. Some of the bigger net metering projects are truly merchant generating systems, which is fine, but they're treated as if they're rooftop solar or on-site net metering, and they're really not.
Are there other comments specifically around the question Senator Bray's raised around pros and cons of raising the 5 megawatt cap? DJ?
Sorry, just want to make sure that one of the reasons for that cap is how ISO New England treats projects, right? So under 5 megawatts are what we collectively kind of refer to as behind the meter. And so those show up kind of as a load reducer for utilities, which allows them to gain more benefits, like it avoids different charges in the New England marketplace. And above 5 megawatts are required to be merchant generators, and so that they're required to participate in the marketplace, I should say, as opposed to required to be merchant generators. They're required to participate in the ISO New England marketplace, so they're in front of the meters, so that ISO New England has visibility into that resource. And so, I think there's ways to talk about how to manage that, but I just wanted to make sure everybody kind of knew one of the reasons for that 5 megawatt threshold.
And does that have any bearing on dispatchability?
I believe, some of the utilities may better be able to answer this, but I believe if you're above 5 megawatts and you're in, treated differently in front of the meter for ISO purposes, that you are able to be dispatched by ISO New England. by that, I really mean curtailed in certain instances. Similar to how any of the larger wind projects in Vermont, they get signals to reduce their output.
Ken, is your comment specific to Senator Bray's question about raising the 5 megawatt cap?
It is.
Go ahead.
I want to agree with TJ. I mean, the greater than 5 megawatts would have a different business structure with the utilities, because those generators would have to be part of the New England dispatch mix. That brings with it a requirement that they can curtail output. There's a requirement for perhaps different control technologies. It also, our experience is when you get to 5 megawatts, you really start seeing some constraints from the A&R permitting, wetlands in particular, and tree clearing. So I don't know that it has to affect the res conversation, and we certainly would be open to larger sizes, but I think it does change the business relationship as you're trying to develop those projects.
William, you had a comment as well. It doesn't need to be related to the cap.
Yeah, it's not, well, it maybe inclusive is not direct. So if nobody else has anything.
Any other comments about the cap? No? Okay, go ahead.
So I just put a question out there, kind of similar to the question I had in the last section, which I don't really think was answered, but we can come back to that another time. Just like the question before, there's going to be new renewable regardless. Why not let the utilities decide to spaz? Same thing here. Distributed generation obviously has its costs and benefits. So what's the argument against letting the utilities decide what is best in their territories and in their locations, and let them proceed on that basis, as opposed to having fixed percentages?
Your question is, what's the argument against? I'm sorry, would you repeat that, William?
Why not leave it up to the utilities to decide what mix of distributed generation makes the most sense for their territories?
Anybody want to respond to that question?
If no one else has a response, Ellen Jankowski, Office of Legislative Counsel, there are stated purposes for the inclusion of Tier 2 as was drafted by the legislature in 2015. So I don't know if any of the utilities have a response, but there was specific consideration about why an inclusion of specific amounts of distributed generation would be beneficial for this system.
Does that raise questions for anyone or need any clarification? William, I don't know if that answers your question. I don't know that I'm not seeing any comments in reaction to it, however.
Yeah, and obviously, maybe this will just be part of a continuing conversation, but if people are saying that there should be fixed percentages as opposed to letting the utilities decide, then I think it's a fair question to ask why. If we don't do fixed percentages, is that not going to meet the statutory goals that have been laid out? And should we stay with those statutory goals? This is sort of the charge of this group, is to consider what changes may be beneficial overall.
Senator Sibilia?
Yeah, so I guess maybe I don't understand Bill's question.
So one of the questions was whether and what should be a mandatory percentage of distributed generation, right? So my question is, again, pretty consistent. I would prefer to see a portfolio that lets utilities decide what percentage makes sense for them based on what the projects that they think make sense for them, rather than prescribing a certain percentage. So the question is, if people don't want to leave it up to the utilities and they want to have a prescribed percentage, why do they feel that that's necessary?
So if I understand correctly, your question is around why prescribing a percentage, but not how utilities meet that percentage. So you're concerned with the percentage period, your question is not about how the percentage is met. Is that right?
If you're talking about what qualifies to meeting that percentage, you know, again, overall, we want it as wide open as possible. But
Well-
since we're discussing, you know, slices at a time here, yes, I guess let's say the initial slice that I would ask is why are we prescribing by percentage of portfolio how much distributed generation the utilities have to have, as opposed to letting them, it might be more, it might be less, letting them make the best fit for their needs.
So you're advocating for reducing the requirements of the current res.
I would advocate eliminating the percentage requirement.
So that would that effectively be a reduction of the current res
I have no idea.
requirements?
That would be depend on what the utilities believe is best for their circumstances. If they believe that they don't need as much as well, I mean, I'm going to imagine they'll have to stick with what they have.
Okay.
If they feel they need more or less than whatever a fixed percentage might be, then it should be more or less. It should make
Okay.
the most design, you know, reliability, affordability, resiliency decisions that they can understand and they can best judge in my view.
Okay, so now I understand, I believe, and I also think it's important to make sure that the utilities have flexibility, but that is in how and perhaps even when, how much time it is required for them to meet the percentages, which I do believe are important to include as a means of making sure that we make progress. I think that there might be some differentiation in terms of timing of how we hit those percentages. And certainly would like to see maximum flexibility for the utilities in terms of determining what types of renewables they use, but definitely strongly support percentage. But thank you for helping me with the clarity on that.
Yeah, and I think maybe we can maybe talk offline, or just because I'm not trying to argue with, I'm trying to understand. In other words, are people saying that they don't think that utilities are going to make the right decisions, I guess? And I'm not putting that in your mouth, Laura, but I would say like that kind of, that's the question that seems to arise if we're doing requirements, whether it's on this question or all the other pieces that we have discussed and will discuss. You know, if you put in these fixed things, you're kind of assuming that utilities will make what people are seeing as the wrong decision. And I guess the question is that really the wrong decision, or why? Or, you know, it does, those are kind of questions I think are underlying the question of what changes we make, if any, to the current laws.
Is the rationale behind a fixed percentage, is that rather than letting the utilities decide, is the rationale for that around an accountability to a certain goal, or what is the rationale behind the fixed percentage? Do you know, Ellen?
So I think generally, when the legislature establishes laws that have requirements for certain percentages of anything, it's to require the actor to do that thing specifically. And so there are stated purposes here. In absence of a percentage, there wouldn't be. I'm having this was written a lot, you know, well before my time, so I can't speak to it specifically, but yes, I think if there's a requirement, it's to encourage compliance with the statute, which would encourage that behavior. So I do think the legislature had a goal to encourage development of renewable, distributed renewable, and they did state some reasons in the purpose section if you'd like me to read them.
William, is that helpful?
Sure. It's just keeping it with the caveat, obviously, that how that fits with these goals, it's fine, but also the goals themselves are subject to the work of this working group and recommendations too. So it's not like there's whatever particular legislative provisions you want to use for context, that's great, but that doesn't mean that we're beholden to them one way or the other in terms of this discussion.
I don't know how long it takes to go over that rationale, or if it's useful if others are still on this conversation, or if your brains are elsewhere. William, because not a lot of other folks voices have chimed in on this one. I'm going to open up the floor again to see what other comments people have on tier two.
Oh, sure. I only put the question out there. No, nobody's forced to answer.
Yep. Yep. So what questions do you have of each other around the tier two or changes you'd like to see, wondering about? Ben, go ahead.
Yeah, mine was a specific, is a specific clarifying question. I have the Zoom in front of me, not the wording, so I might be getting this a little bit wrong, but in the question about the tier two percentage, there were a couple, three, I think, sort of qualifying aspects after the question about the percentage. One of them said, essentially premised the whole thing on tier two, including all low impact hydroelectric institute certified facilities in the definition of tier two. That's how I read it anyway. I didn't really see that until I read it like the third or fourth time, but rereading it now, it does seem like that's what the wording would mean, which seems like it must have been unintentional. If you're looking at a Lehigh certified hydro in New England plus New York, that's like 1,500 megawatts, including individual. Might have been the earlier. There were like two questions about question 9, I think, or there were two questions that sort of asked a similar thing.
Yeah, I'm trying to find what you're looking at.
Yeah, this one. So renewable energy under 5 megawatts. So that's the current definition of tier two connected to the distribution grid, plus all Lehigh power of any size, including utility defined by new distributed. So basically, to me, that says like add all of this stuff to the current tier two definition. And my concern is that if you add all Lehigh, it's 1,500 megawatts in the region that produces more on an annual basis than all of the electric usage in Vermont, and includes individual dams that are hundreds of megawatts, which is just entirely different than anything that tier two has ever been remotely connected to, and would frankly swamp and more or less eliminate tier two in terms of practical uses. So I assume that wasn't intended, but I just wanted to clarify. And I put this in my comment, but the last thing I'll say is that to me seems very, very different in kind than the second part of that statement, like small utility owned dams connected to the grid in Vermont, which would be, depending on how you define it, like which utilities are in or out, like 10 to a few dozen megawatts, very different than all Lehigh.
I will admit that there's a lot of that goes over my head because I'm not in the field that all of you are in. What is popping up in yours? Any reactions to Ben's comment? Questions, reactions, challenges? Ken, is your comment related to Ben?
It seemed, oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm glad Ben raised it, because actually when I answered that question, I had presumed in my head it was Vermont-based Lehigh. I wasn't even thinking about the region. So I would tend to agree with him. I mean, Lehigh in Vermont seems like it should qualify more broadly. If we're going to stick with tier two, in regard to Bill's question, if tier two is going to continue to exist, tying it to Vermont based, but expanding the ability for other resources seems like it would make most sense to me. Thanks.
Christopher?
Well, I guess I heard Ben asking the question of sort of, I don't know who wrote the survey, but maybe just to make it very plain, did folks mean to include all of that hydro, or was that just a wording mistake?
So that question is going to go to your legislative team.
Well, and we don't need to nitpick. Do you mean that?
Representative Sibilia?
I literally am going to have to hang up here in 30 seconds, but definitely helped facilitate the language for the survey. If there are objections around the language, I suggest we get clarity about that. And unfortunately, I have to sign off. Thanks.
Well, so just because there is just confusion around this, maybe I can put this in writing using a little bit more than the 200 characters I had in the survey, and email it to the legislative team and you and Sorsha, and we can just try to track this to ground before the next meeting.
I think the legislative team always welcomes those comments, so absolutely.
Okay.
And if there's, the kernel here that you can all come back to and that your question invites is, what do you want to have understood? What does that question raise for you that you wanted to speak to? Whether or not you understand where the question came from.
Yeah, at the risk of not helping here, I don't think anybody intended tier 2 to be out of state anything, including low impact hydro. So I think we can just put that to bed if we all agree. This means low impact hydro in state of any size is how I read the question and how I imagine it was intended. But
I would just agree. Like, I think I was thinking of it in the context of the existing tier 2 framework, which does, presume it's going to be Vermont based. So never would I have thought that it was other than that. And I think it was just, it seems like we have consensus on sort of how folks had read that based on the existing framework and assumptions of the tier 2.
Is there anybody who assumed otherwise, that it's not in state?
Can I ask one more clarifying, if we're continuing on this line? In state of any size would still include 450 megawatts or more of dams on the Connecticut. I think those technically are both in and out of state. At least if you look at LIHI's chart, it's like VT/NH. And that by itself, even if all of the other dams in the region don't qualify, would still be a dramatic departure from tier 2. So that any size is a concern, even if we're talking about only dams that have some footprint in Vermont.
are those rated as low impact hydro or have any possibility of being rated as low impact hydro?
That's my
I don't
understanding.
know.
I looked at LIHI's website, and you can download a list of all of their currently certified dams, and there are 2 or 3 Great River facilities on that list, one of which I think is 350 megawatts, another one's 100 or close to 100.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions about tier 2? What's top of mind? What do you need to know about each other's positions or questions you might have for each other? Too specific. Tier 2 is quiet.
I guess I could ask a question. Seems to me the central debate is about how much tier 2 requirement, people want to have. And right now it's 10%. There's been pushes historically to grow that to as much as 30% is what I've seen. So to me, that's the central debate that this group needs to wrestle with.
Does that observation spark anything for anyone? And William? If you're frozen, Ken.
Or
Oh, you're there. Ken, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, did you have a comment?
Yeah, we can go first, but I do have a comment to Christopher's question.
Yep, the floor is open to that. Go ahead.
Great. At least for me, the question of how much tier 2 is an economic question and a utility territory size question. Because the way tier 2 is structured right now, it really drives utilities to solar. That's the primary resource that can qualify. And if you're building solar in the existing structure of the way ISO New England works, you really have to build it inside your territory. It's not a resource that you can pay to build somewhere else and wheel it across the transmission system to get what you need. So you're either building solar within your territory, or you're having to buy the tier 2 RECs from someone else. Right now, the market's like $39 a REC, so it's a very expensive resource. So much like the conversation around large hydro is linked to some other things, for me, the amount of tier 2 percentage really is linked to, can we get resources in there that allow the smaller territory utilities to comply without being forced down a very expensive path? And that's why the small hydro LIHI question becomes very important for us. So I think there's kind of an analysis that needs to go on of economically, how can utilities do this versus what could that percentage?
Is there any analysis available to answer that question?
In terms of the cost of tier 2 versus other tiers, I think the analysis the department is doing has these different scenarios, right, that have different penetrations of tier 2 versus business as usual, a regional tier versus and each other. And it will show a cost difference in kind of what those values are. And if the regional market departs from a tier 2, then there's like a trade-off there in terms of what those costs are. And I think so. That analysis is coming. I showed you kind of the draft results last week, and we'll have more refined results or final results soon.
Go ahead, William. Christopher, actually, before you go, William, Christopher, did you have follow-up to Ken's?
Yeah, just to, well, no, for TJ, just quickly is to Ken's point, that it is very different. The analysis is different by utility because of the regional piece. I agree with that. And so can you tell us if the analysis we expect is broken down by utility? Or
right, sorry, maybe I misunderstood the question, but it won't be by utility, our analysis. The model will be available, and you can put different loads in for your own utility and embedded resources, what you already have. But that's a kind of a follow-on step from the work we're doing.
So utilities will be able to do that on their own if they. Yes, the tool will be available.
Yes. Yeah.
Peter?
We're the only state in ISO New England that has an in-state purchasing requirement, and it's RPS. We have the second lowest rates in New England. And so I think, when we're talking about in-state renewables and moving forward, there is some capacity to move forward with some more in-state renewables in different for each utility, but that's why we're having a percentage. But there is a way to move forward on in-state renewables without setting rates through the roof. I think our experience with our existing res demonstrates that.
Other comments on this topic before we take on a new one? William?
So I was just going to add on to Chris's original question. And I think Ken and Peter have touched upon it a bit. But I think the question really is, if you're going to ask hypothetically, if you move from 10 to 30%, say, well, the question is what, and it's within the context of either 100% clean or 100% renewable. What benefits are you gaining from doing that? And then what is the cost of those benefits? And, unless we get answers to that and can really think about that and make a judgment, I don't know how you make a good decision unless you have that information. So, and so I don't think we're going to have that here today, but as we move forward, if we're going to make a decision on that question, I would think we would need to have that information to consider.
I just respond to Bill. This information is out there, Bill. I think you can review it. It might be helpful to take a a look. If you look at 30 VSA, section 8001, you will see the purposes of distributed generation that were articulated by the legislature. You'll find them in 30 VSA 8005. If you wanted to take a look at the social benefits, you could evaluate the social cost of carbon. That is an analysis that was recommended by the Vermont Climate Council. It's used across the country. It's very applicable here. You could evaluate that. You could take a look at DPS's data where they did this sort of cost benefit analysis. You could do like an economic analysis that will look at the job growth, the broader economic impacts from additional renewable energy development in specific regions. You could look at preventing line losses by putting the distributed generation closer to the load. You could look at resilience by having distributed generation such that if a massive centralized generation source goes offline, then you have backup that's close to the source that can continue to keep lights on when they might otherwise be off. And so I guess the point that I'm trying to make is this information is out there. It has long been out there. We could hash it out. I just don't know that we necessarily need to, since much of it has already been discussed. And the data provided by DPS, for example, has already been made available. So the cost of carbon analysis has already been done. The legislative purposes in 2001 and 5 have already been raised. I guess I would just suggest that we don't need to belabor the point too much more.
Yeah, is that Chase? I can only see you really small.
That is Chase, yeah.
It is, yeah, I'm in the room.
Yeah, Chase. I think the topics and categories of what kinds of benefits, what kind of goals, what kind of considerations, categories are laid out there in statute. But there are more specific information and different values if you actually apply it to the question at hand. So if you go to 10, 15, 20, 30, 50, 60, 75% distributed generation or whatnot, those have different calculations of what the actual benefits of those specific decisions would be or projected to be and what the costs would be. And those benefits and costs are different in the specifics given the specific changes you want to make to the statute in terms of the percentage. And I would think that given the charge of this working group, it is not incumbent or upon me alone to get that information. I think that kind of information is rather obviously central, making an informed and responsible decision in this body to make recommendations. And therefore, I think that kind of information should be presented and discussed by the group in front of the group.
I guess my point was I think much of it already has. And I'm not saying I shouldn't have the conversation. I'm just saying we have been having the conversation. We have been looking at the data. We have been looking at the cost benefit analyses. And so I just want to ground us in the road we have already tread. Because we've done much of this work. I'm not saying we shouldn't continue, but I just wanted to make that point.
And great.
No.
And I think that information, those analyses and those numbers can be circulated to the group, be posted on the website if it isn't already, and we can talk about it.
So here's what I recognize, questions 12, 13, and 14. 12 was asking about the percentage of distributed renewable energy. Should it change into what? And it gave a continuum of percentages. And then the next question was, should the current list of tier 2 eligible resources change? And that's what all the comments went to, is what the changes should be. It doesn't actually talk about the rationale for why someone chose a specific percentage. So you don't have a whole lot of insight on people's inner thinking about when they were choosing a percentage, what they were thinking. We'll have some updated analysis available to you to use. I don't know if it's going to answer this question or not. The analysis coming out of the department sometime within the next week or so, and then also Brattle Group's macroeconomics analysis available to this group with them to decode it a little bit on November 15th. So if there are specific questions that you're wondering, it would be great to get them in front of Brattle Group before they come see you on the 15th. If you were wondering about the benefits or the costs of these different percentage changes. I will send out an invitation for some of those specific questions so that if there's answers available, you can get them. Peter, did you have a question? Ellen, did you have a thought?
Now if you're going to move on.
if you have a thought, take it and then we'll see where it takes us.
Sure, I would just say that based on the poll results, it looks like with the exception of 4 respondents, everyone wanted to either not change the percentage or increase the percentage. So unless the four respondents who skipped it wanted to eliminate, I don't know if anyone else in the group is interested in eliminating tier 2 entirely. So if no one else is interested in that, we may not need to delve further, as Jay said.
Okay. The absence of raised hands tells me that you're ready to move on to the next question. Next question actually shifts to tier 3. And we've not talked about tier 3 in this group very much yet. Let me pull up this scroll before, let me get to the right page on this document before I pull it up. Save your eyes. Oh. The question was, would you suggest any changes to tier 3? Question 16 is simply, if yes, what changes? Those of you who indicated yes, there should be changes, cited things like ambiguity about you're wondering how the clean heat standard would impact tier 3. There was comments about increasing commitments to tier 3 where possible, and several comments that reinforced a call for flexibility in how, again, utilities meet overall greenhouse gas reductions. Comments under no or skip, those of you who answered no or skip to that question. Generally, the sentiment is that tier 3 is working well and that there are more impactful challenges to figure out other than those in tier 3. But with that said, again, that's not comprehensive. Take a look at the comments, and please, if you have questions for each other, this is a good time to ask them. Are there any comments or questions around tier 3?
Well, I'll just throw a couple of things that I'm thinking about, and I guess I don't have a firmly realized position on either of these, but I have a lot of interest in trying to figure out how tier 3 interacts with the clean heat standard and how well that's going to work. And frankly, if there's a need for a tier 3 under the RES, if the clean heat standard works efficiently and effectively and well, like I think it's meant to do. So I don't have a firm position on that one way or the other, but I think it's something we ought to think about collectively. And secondly, I think there might be some value in allowing tier 3 credits to count to the tier 3 to the tier 2 mandate, kind of like the tier 2 credits can count towards tier 3 now. And I guess, probably being newer to this world than most of the people here, I guess I haven't thought through that fully, but I think there might be some advantages to some of the points that Ken's raised and others have raised about giving flexibility as we work towards meeting the goals that we share in doing that. I think there might be some value to that. So I'll just put that out there as 2 things I would like to talk about as part of this process, and 2 things that I'm trying to figure out what I think about them on my own. Thanks.
It makes sense to take them one at a time. Your second piece, just so that I can come back to it in a way that's clear, is around asking if there's any advantages to, right now, tier 3 applies to tier 2 mandates and if vice versa.
But yeah, so right now you can count your tier 2 achievements credits can count towards meeting your tier 3 obligations. And there might be some benefit both to our goals and to individual utilities and having the inverse also be true. There may also be problems with that idea, which my fellow utility folks might raise, and I'm open to that. But yeah, basically, if you make the credits bi-directional instead of one direction.
That one's very specific. Are there comments, or what does that raise for you? And this I'm talking about is tier 2 credits meeting tier 3 obligations. Does it make sense to make that bi-directional, to go both ways rather than just one? Ellen?
So from a practical perspective, why you could just merge the tiers at that point, couldn't you? And then it would just be a single tier. I mean, because otherwise, I'm not sure what you're gaining.
You could.
That's my initial reaction.
Would you lose anything by merging them?
Yeah, that's.
Go ahead, Ken. I'm sorry, your hand was stuck behind the live button.
It's okay. I took it down because I really didn't have a reaction to Lewis's, but the last comment got me. I mean, the calculation of the credits is completely different. So tier 2, it's tied to actual generation that meets the criteria. Tier 3 is a very complicated, like megawatt hour equivalent based on fossil fuels and the efficiency and what your resource mix is. So I think it would be better to keep them separate for tracking purposes and just have the opportunity to use one versus the other when it's appropriate. If you kind of meld them together, I think you get into kind of a mess as you're trying to create the credits themselves. If I could, I'd also, to Lewis's point on the clean heat standard, I mean, I saw conflicting comments in those who answered no. Some saying that the tier 3 and clean heat credits need to be completely separate, and some of us saying that they should work together.
Yeah.
To me, it's hard to answer this tier 3 question until we know how the clean heat standard credits are actually going to be determined and tracked. You know, we have to coordinate with Efficiency Vermont right now to make sure that we're tracking energy efficiency credits and tier 3 credits separately. And now we're throwing a third credit into the mix, and the economics around how that works could get very dicey depending on how you put the definitions together. So I think it's hard for this group to know where to go until we understand a little more where that clean heat standard's coming out.
When will you know that?
So the bill we passed has,
2025.
has a design coming back to the legislature for evaluation and action in 25.
So one of the challenges is that you're not going to have that insight for a little while longer to know how the clean heat standard interacts with tier 3. Okay.
Yes.
Bill, is this related to the clean heat standard and tier 3?
Yeah, I think so. Kind of also want to note with appreciation that Chris and I were able to have the same comments on this section. I think Lewis,
yes.
Lewis touched on a few things, and Ken kind of. My question really is just what other changes are sort of out there or proposed or possible. That was sort of my response. I didn't really have a response because I wasn't really sure what was really being proposed in terms of changes to be able to react to. So I don't know if there's anything beyond what Lewis brought up already, or if there are other ideas out there that people can throw out or follow up with just to be able to consider them.
Yeah, for tier 3, other comments are welcome. And Darren's got his hand up. I just want to make a quick correction. It is true, William, thank you for pointing that out, that when I was putting pieces together, I attributed one of these comments, I think, to 2 people. But it would be the first name that the comment goes to, and the second one is a mistake on my part. Because, yeah, I know. That would be
I thought we had
what a coincidence. Darren, did you still have a comment? Is it related to the clean heat standard, or is it something different?
Well, related to the overall conversation on tier 3. I think our view is that tier 3 is working really well. It underpins a number of really important strategic electrification incentive programs for our customers, and is a key element of our goal in Burlington to meeting our net zero energy goal. And I think we may not be aware of how much flexibility that it provides to us in Vermont relative to other states. When we want to roll out a new program, when we want to update our programs, the tier 3 process provides a really flexible opportunity to do that. And in other states where utilities try to do the same thing, they may have to go through months or even years of regulatory process to reach the same point. So I think if we're in favor of strategic electrification and doing so in a thoughtful, technically and practically feasible way that benefits customers, the program's working really well. The one thing I would note, and that we've been interested in, is our goal in Burlington is to go above and beyond Tier 3 when we can. That's hard to do. It requires a significant effort. We've issued a net zero energy revenue bond back in 2022 to help us bolster some of our incentive programs. So we would like some provision or some language ultimately that makes clear that the goal of Tier 3 is not a ceiling for utilities, and that if utilities go above and beyond it, if they're able to, that they're encouraged to do so, and that they won't be held accountable in a negative way for doing so, provided that they meet the other criteria of the program. Obviously, there's a ACP. You can't do measures above the ACP. Within Tier 3, we try to do things at the lowest possible cost. But our intent is to continue to try to strive to do as much as we can with that program. And so if the RES was being amended, we might have a suggested line or two relative to that. And I just wanted to flag that for the group.
Comments or reactions to that suggested line or comment? What would that line or comment sound like, Darren?
Well, maybe something to the effect of to support additional progress towards Vermont's climate goals, utilities are encouraged where possible to procure additional Tier 3 credits above and beyond their annual requirement, provided that doing so, it's done at cost levels that are below the applicable alternative compliance payment.
Thoughts, reactions?
I'll just say a couple things. I guess one, I think Tier 3 serves a really different purpose than Tier 2. And it really is beneficial electrification. It's to drive a transition away from combusting fossil fuels towards alternatives. Whereas Tier 2 is distributed generation, putting the generation closer to the places where it's used. And so they're different. And what Darren just described is creating basically a floor rather than a ceiling for Tier 3 and creating permissive regulatory structure. That sounds really intriguing, frankly. And if we're serious about encouraging the types of switching away from combusting fossil fuels to clean electrification, I think that sounds like a pretty flexible and a reasonable approach without necessarily opening up Tier 3 in a really expansive way, which I recognize that could be challenging to do in the context of what we're ultimately trying to do here. So just I think we're generally be supportive of the direction Darren has taken.
Ken? Yeah, I think, Ken, do you have a comment related to that?
I do, and I hate to disagree with Darren. We usually don't, but I think we would have a concern that if that language got inserted without other guidance, that it very quickly at the PUC and DPS turns into an expectation and a requirement, even though it may not be a percentage in the legislation. So I think we'd want to be very careful to make sure that utilities maintain their flexibility. And I would also know, I'm particularly concerned around the clean heat standard, specifically because we've heard comments coming out of the DPS's review of the Tier 3 measures that they're looking to reduce the amount of credits utilities get around electric vehicles and heat pumps, both because federal incentives are now coming in and they're questioning how much the utility rebates are actually driving adoption of the vehicles. And because as the appliance standards increase, there's questions around how much the utility rebates are causing the adoption of the heat pumps. So if you're combining a reduction in the credits that the utilities get with increasing requirements on tier 3 and bringing in a whole nother series of participants through the clean heat standard who are going to be trying to get customers to adopt the same technologies. It's a recipe for raising the cost of utilities and thereby the rates for customers, unless the clean heat standard, tier 3, and the efficiency utility efforts are very tightly coordinated. And that's why I'm reluctant to take a position on this until we see what the overall picture looks like.
Thoughts, reactions, questions? Darren?
Just a brief response. Appreciate Ken's point, and I would want to be crystal clear that what we're advocating for would not be for any particular additional requirement, and it would have to be written in a way that didn't provide an additional requirement, but really encouragement and flexibility for utilities where possible to go above and beyond tier 3. Because I respect the point. And even, in our case, we've had years earlier in the implementation of tier 3 where we weren't able to procure enough measures and we had to use, different means of meeting the standard. So I know that customer measures, relying on those can be challenging. And so completely agreed with the idea that this should be a voluntary encouragement, not a requirement. And also on the broader kind of clean heat point, I agree with some of Ken's concerns, making sure that heat pumps and other key technologies remain a core component of the tier 3 program. Tier 3 obviously is broader than just heat. We work on transportation, we work on lawn equipment, other technologies within tier 3, but there's definitely appropriate caution in making sure that this program can overlap well with the clean heat program as that rolls out. And doesn't cause implementation challenges. So those are all points that are well taken, but I just wanted to be clear, we're not advocating for a change in the requirement or the percentages, but simply a flexibility to go above and beyond where possible.
Thanks.
So 2 comments. One, we've been consistently for not just tier 3, but generally the renewable energy standard being treated as a floor, not a ceiling. So I don't want to raise that on tier 1 and tier 2. But as it specifically relates to tier 3, the sort of thing that Darren's bringing forward, I think makes a lot of sense, giving utilities flexibility to do more if that's something they think is right for them and their customers or members. The other point I wanted to make is on the clean heat standard. It's been noted, but I just want to emphasize that is the rulemaking there is just getting rolling. And I think changing tier 3 midstream would almost certainly be a bad idea. And if on the off chance that there is some kind of tweak that's needed, I don't think we're going to know that until sometime during the legislative session. So my suggestion would be focusing this conversation on the 1, 2, and 1A or new renewables, and mostly just accepting that we're not going to really know whether it's a good idea to open up tier 3 until months from now. And I think probably it isn't going to be a good idea, at least from our perspective.
William.
Well, I think Ben raised some good points there. I was going to ask, obviously, it is an ongoing process with the clean heat standard. They've been asking some initial questions and getting some comments and feedbacks. I don't know off the top of my head whether they have an idea of a schedule of what questions what the sort of schedule is for the kind of issues or questions they're going to raise and get responses from, and whether TJ or somebody at the department, whether it would be of any value for them to summarize sort of where things are at, or when they think that some questions are going to come up in that process. Maybe kind of echoing maybe some of the underlying points Ben was making. Maybe it's not worth that exercise, but I was just going to kind of raise, I don't know if TJ has any thoughts, whether there's anything tangible enough or known enough in terms of what they've discussed so far and when they're going to get to questions that might be relevant to this discussion.
Yeah, I think the target date of 2025 is probably the right one when tangible results will be like readily available for a legislative session. The department is issuing a request for proposals for a potential study, or did issue a request for reviewing proposals now. The timeline for that is, after this upcoming session will be the results of the potential study. And so that's like kind of a lot of technical analysis will lead to a lot of information available to make policy decisions on. So, as far as the specific dates and the PUC workshops, others probably know better than me. I'm actually not the lead on that at the department, but we are going through it, and I don't think there's going to be a lot done in time for January 2024.
Yeah, Jeffrey.
I was looking to find out how to fit my comments into these comments, but I apologize. Again, I'll say we're a little unique, so I'm just going to go out with the uniqueness that we are. When we talk about beneficial electrification for GlobalFoundries, our goal is looking to reduce our electrical usage year after year, even if we have every employee in our parking lot charging their vehicles during the course of the day. It's going to be a net on our overall energy usage. So that's we're looking for an alternate way to help comply with tier 3. Likely think with our thermal emissions that'll get impacted more with a clean heat standard. Don't really see anything viable today to convert our heating over at this point. Maybe something will come along in the future. Where we can have a bigger impact in the overall reduction of greenhouse gases is in our manufacturing emissions. And to take some language that's already in the res today, there's a section of the res that applies to an ability of a manufacturer to lower their prorated share of the standard offer language by reducing manufacturing emissions voluntarily below permit thresholds. That for dollar is where GlobalFoundries can make the best investment in lowering its greenhouse gas emissions differently than through electrification, differently than through thermal emissions. That's the best opportunity that we have. So we'd like to take a look at the ability to address the greenhouse gas emissions as a whole and put that as an option on the table that we could use some of the existing language that's already in the res standard and apply it to the tier 3.
Where is that language in the res standard?
It's 8006A.
Comments, thoughts, reactions? Are others of you knowing what that language is? Yeah. I didn't know if the silence was not knowing where to look at it or if it wasn't that you just didn't have any input on that proposal.
Uh, 8006A, you said?
Yeah, I believe so. Let me just check.
Are you noticing or wondering if anything on this question? Are your brains still on this question? So a lot of people have been looking at their computers to look at 8006A using some of that language in tier 3. If there isn't any discussion on it, then I can move on, but I just wanted to see if you're actually actively thinking on it or if you're moving on to other topics.
I'd like to follow up, but maybe not right now. I'd like to understand a little more what you're thinking before I cohesive response. Makes sense.
Okay. Any other comments related to tier 3? Right. There are a couple other questions left on the poll. 17 asked if there were any other changes that you would think should be made to the Renewable Energy Standard Program. It's probably not a surprise to you that there was a wide range of comments here, and many of those comments are echoing points that you've made in this discussion and elsewhere in the survey. So rather than summarize those, I do still want to hold space, encourage you to take a moment to sit with each other's written comments. If you have questions or clarifications that you haven't stated yet on any of those pieces, and that's a pretty important piece because your time is starting to run a little short. If you have a new question or clarification based on any of the comments that you see, this is a great time to ask each other. If not, then we'll move on to the next question. It's a hard question to ask on the fly. It would have required that you'd made a note for yourself somewhere in the margin and wanted to ask about it, probably because there were a lot of comments to read through. I am preparing then to move on to the next question. Liz, did you have a comment?
No, go ahead.
So this is question 18. I'm going to share my screen because it's a dense question, and I'm wondering what it tells you. So to what extent do you agree with the following statements? There are 3 there. You can see the scale, 1 being strongly disagree to 5 being strongly agree. Vermont should have one uniform standard for all utilities. So there's a lot of agreement around that answer. Vermont should have a renewable energy standard with several different sets of requirements for different categories of utility. Still, there's a trend there. Any questions on that one or questions you wanted to ask of each other?
Sure.
Yeah.
So when we did the original res in 2015, the main accommodation between, in terms of thinking about the smaller utilities was that there was a 2-year delay for implementation to let people get, one, to let the larger utilities go first. So there was a bit of a learning curve. So smaller utilities could see what happened to their bigger colleagues. And also, so it just gave more time to prepare, but we didn't, the goals are the same. It's just a delayed rollout. And I don't know if that's what people are thinking about in terms of, if there's any change going forward, that it have the same sort of delay built in, or are people thinking of more nuanced, more granular adjustments for amongst the different utilities?
Were you thinking about different sets of requirements in this answering this question other than timing or phasing? Hey, Peter?
Well, we were certainly, a group of us were considering, for the utilities that are already at 100% renewable under the law, instead of giving them, a tiered requirement, think about some percentage of new load. Because we would not, as Lewis has said, ever want to incentivize taking offline a renewable that's already working. And that's effectively what you do with premium tier requirement for 100% renewable utilities under the current res, right? So it's not, just to be clear, it's not for when a utility gets to 100%. It's the ones in the law right now, which are BED, Wet, and Swamp.
Other comments? So a couple of you have raised your hands. You might be waiting for me to catch up to speed on that. Let me stop my share for just a moment so we can see you. Darren, and then Ken.
Thank you. I just wanted to, and I think I'm echoing maybe Peter's comment there. Just note that in the original RES, there was that distinction already in some cases for utilities that had already met 100%. So I think that the current RES already has some distinguishing factors relative to that. And we would certainly see, to Lewis's point earlier and to Peter's point just now, we would see the kind of greater focus for those of us who are at 100% being on load growth. And so I wanted to support both Lewis's earlier comment and Peter's comment just now relative to that.
And from our perspective, the bill, the existing res also has a provision for VEPSA member utilities to meet it in the aggregate. So that's allowed us over time to look like a bigger utility. So we can work in various territories to build some of this. We'd want to continue that. And I think the conversation around trying to keep existing renewables on and bring value there is particularly important for us. So we were thinking a little more nuanced than just saying a time delay. There would be some other differences between the utilities.
Do you have any comments or clarifications around those two requirements other than timing and phasing as they've been stated here around so that we can catch them? The third, let me pull up my screen again. Oh, sorry, Ben, go ahead.
Just two quick things. One, Ken, could you send around the line, or at least send to me, I don't know if everyone else wants it, the citation for the VIPSA meeting stuff in the aggregate. I was looking for it actually earlier after your comments around tier 2, and I just couldn't put my hands on it quickly. So if you've got it at your fingertips. And then the other comment, just very briefly, and we definitely don't have time to unpack this now, but I just wanted to note on your earlier question, Jen, about the sort of other aspects question, the open-ended one. I think it's really important that we do actually like dig into equity beyond affordability. Equity of access is also an important consideration that really we haven't gotten right in Vermont. You know, the ability of renters and low-income Vermonters and on to actually be directly a part of this transition. But I would suggest we put a pin in that and return to it at a later date.
Hopefully that becomes a really important part of the conversation on November 15th when you look at macroeconomics and you can pair that with accessibility kinds of questions as well. I'm going to share my screen again so you can see that answer. There's just one more statement to review and ask if there's any comments on this last one. Vermont should continue to utilize, Rebecca? Okay. Vermont should continue to utilize procurement programs to help meet RES purchasing requirements, and there's quite a spread there, so there might be comments to follow. Rebecca, go ahead.
So I'm not sure if everyone means the same thing about purchasing requirements, but net metering is, I would also argue, one of the, for us, certainly a pretty critical hot topic. It doesn't fall under some of the tiers, but it's very related to the tiers and is part of the broader renewable energy community. I would put it under sort of purchasing requirements piece. And so there wasn't a lot in the survey about net metering specifically, just in the comments, but just wanted to hold that as likely another hefty area that we're going to have to dive into.
Yeah, I would like to just second that and say I think we ought to reserve a significant amount of time for that in the meetings after the consultants meeting, because it's taking up a lot of the rate space is taking up a lot of the available rates. So I would like to second Rebecca's comment and ask that we make that an agenda item for one of the last two meetings.
Well, I'll hold that as how to incorporate into the agenda. A question I have for you also around net metering is if there are questions specifically that you want to ask the macroeconomics consultants around net metering while they're here in conversation, and see if the analysis will give you any insight on that. Peter?
I agree we should at some point have a discussion about net metering. I think it's critical that we're all working from the same set of facts and understanding of the impact on ratepayers and all that. And, one of my asks then, and I think we should try to get a little closer on, where we are on how much new renewables and all that. That helps guide the discussion. I mean, is net metering going to be all of it? Is it going to be the slice? So we're getting toward that. But for the consultant for this group, I would love to, I don't know if you could put out there, can we brainstorm questions to ask about data we want around net metering, just so we all have the same numbers of what we're talking about. We hear concerns about rate shifting impacts and what does that mean and how does that sugar out? Like, I don't know what those numbers are. Can we somehow brainstorm numbers so we can all be working out what is the impact of net metering today and what it might be going forward?
Well, it's such a great question because when I look at how many minutes we have left of this meeting, I don't know how many minutes there are to actually.
Yeah, we can't do that now.
No.
Yeah, I get it.
But what there is sort of baked in is your one piece of homework between today and when you meet again 2 weeks from now is to send it via survey form the questions you have for Brattle macroeconomics related questions.
Right.
We'll collect them in aggregate. It's not a promise that Brattle Group can answer all of them, but if they know what they are, then they can target some of that discussion to what you really care about. And your thinking may evolve even after you submit those questions, so I'd encourage you to jot down your notes as well so that you can bring them to the discussion in a targeted way. But the wider question, how to talk about net metering and the concept of the work of these remaining meetings, you can bring to the co-chairs to talk about.
And one other piece, just to tag on to what Rebecca said, net metering is a procurement program, right? I mean, the other one that we used to have is called standard offer. It doesn't exist. Do we want to have a discussion about replacing or creating another procurement program or extending for larger projects? Does that make sense in the context of what we're doing? We should have that discussion. Maybe it's yes, maybe it's no.
My guess is probably there's lots of different things you will all add to that discussion. Let me bring it to the co-chairs and see where it might fit in. Thank you. So back to comments and net metering being one. We're gonna run up into public comment here soon. So I still wonder how many of you might be sitting on a reaction or a comment under this third red line down the bottom. To the extent that you agree or disagree with Vermont should continue to utilize procurement programs to help meet RES purchasing requirements. If you haven't spoken yet and you have a comment to share on that. William, I'm only holding for a minute, see if anyone hasn't spoken yet and has a comment. Go ahead, William.
Yeah, I only had a clarifying question. I didn't know if there was anything else on the table other than net metering in terms of what was meant by that.
Sorry, I missed that last phrase. Anything else on the table? What?
Other than net metering in terms of what that question was trying to address, whether there were new or other ideas that were under consideration. So it was just a clarifying question.
Great. And I'm just going to change that question a little bit, that regardless of what the question was asking, when you were answering it, did you have in mind? Net metering comes to mind, other things?
Right. I didn't know if other folks had other things in mind.
Yeah. It's quiet. Does that mean there aren't any other comments or things coming to mind? Okay. The very last question on the survey poll was, if you believe that the renewable energy standard should be addressing any other policy areas, please note them here. You may submit more than one answer. And very similar, this is where you'll hear echoes of all of your conversations showing up in this list. We're not going to review them right now. But I do encourage you to, if you do have questions of each other that are specific and targeted around some of these things, and you read someone's comment, and you're wondering what would be in that, you find a way to ask that question and get that clarification. Are there any questions that you wanted to ask here? Go ahead, Senator Bray.
Yeah, so just to tee it up for a future conversation, not to get an answer now, there's an intriguing remark here. It says the process of looking at RES needs to be honest and comprehensive about the costs and benefits of net metering from taxpayer infrastructure and carbon reduction standpoint. It's an important conversation. I know it's not a part of this per se, but I think we've struggled a little bit in recent years just for not having comprehensive data to look at it very fully. So that's it. I'm sort of putting a plea out for anyone who might be able to develop an answer along those lines to help us somewhere down the line.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask what kind of data folks are looking for. Department has a distributed generation database, basically, of interconnected distributed generation by size and type. And that data, we presented on that data. Annual energy report has a whole appendix that is like a 40 page report on net metering. That was last year. We do that every 2 years, so we won't have that in depth this year, but we do still track the data as it comes. All the utilities need to report their distributed generation to ISO New England, and we get a copy of that and compile it. So I don't want to commit to doing new work right now because what we have is what we have, but if there's that, and I think that's all been made available to anybody who wants it and folks know of that data. I'm just curious, what is the other data that people are looking for?
It's helpful because what I am learning, and JFO, you can certainly correct me on this one, but that the analysis of net metering isn't included in Brattle Group's work, so there's going to be limited what they can actually answer to with that. So that question becomes really relevant because people did have questions around net metering, where to go for the answers. And we have a lot of people in public comment. So I don't know if we're going to be able to get the answer to that, what people are wondering right now in conversation. We can see what happens on the other end of public comment and come back to it, or I can put it into a survey question.
I prefer a survey question.
You can think about it.
One other thing for folks to think about is the analysis that the department's doing, which feeds into the Brattle Group, right, has an assumption for how much net metering happens under the business as usual. Basically, we have 25 megawatts a year now, that continuing forward, whether that or not that happens or not, and then it actually declines after several years. So that's an assumption. We didn't really play with that assumption in the scenarios, but what's possible to do later on, I think, is to say, okay, if we had a different amount of net metering and replaced by market purchases, that kind of thing, then that changes the cost structure. Net metering has one cost, larger projects have a different cost. And so it's in the model, there's the possibility of playing with that assumption. And so I just want to throw that out there for people to think about as they see the model. Nobody has, I don't believe anybody has actually asked us for the model. We can't post it online because it's just, our web system doesn't work, but nobody's asked us for the model. Just throw that out there too.
Okay.
TJ, for the report you already have, like from a year ago, could you send that to us so we can put it into a distribution for the group?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so the SDA analysis that's coming out will have an assumption about net metering, and also the second piece, the model can be used to run different assumptions, and EPS can be asked for that model. Now, we need to shift to public comment. So I'm going to close the page on this and just organize myself. How many people do you have
11. We have 15 minutes, so roughly a minute apiece, maybe a little more, a little less on some folks. Are we? Okay. So, good morning. So we're moving into public comment, and I'm going to read through names, call on people. As you know, we have roughly 15 minutes and 11 people on our list currently, so I'll ask people to aim for about a minute or so and try to keep moving right along. And as always, if you have longer remarks, please feel free to send them directly to the committee. You can submit as much testimony and information as you like. So with that, jump right in. The first up is Kelly Wantuk.
She's on there. There she is. Kelly, if you can hear me, you can unmute.
All right, so if we're not getting a response, I'll mark that and we'll come back to Kelly.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Good job.
Okay, perfect. So I'm gonna get going here. Okay, hi, my name is Kelly Wantuk, and I am from the village of Northfield. I have a daughter who's age 2. Her name is Reese, and I have another on the way in March. And yeah, I'm here because I want to defend the chance for my children to have a place that they can live and thrive in. Warmer earth temperatures will cause more extreme weather events, such as the recent floods we saw in July and last year's drought conditions. Vermont proclaims itself as an agricultural state, but needs to take the necessary measures to defend its agricultural lands from climate change. We all saw local farmlands impacted and crops destroyed from these recent floods. But as these events become more frequent, this makes me very, very scared as a mother that my children won't have clean water to drink, healthy food to eat, and a safe environment to prosper in. And more research is showing, as we know, that the urgency to act now to reduce carbon emissions to prevent ecological catastrophe on our planet. So with that, I want us to prioritize electricity sources that don't impact our local food systems, that don't harm other communities, and that actually reduce our carbon emissions. So this means wind and solar rather than large hydro that produces methane emissions and destroys traditional indigenous lands. And that is it. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you. I forgot one step. Is there anyone in the room who wants to offer public comment this morning? Thank you. Back to the list. Charlotte Roberts.
Hi. My name is Charlotte Roberts. I'm 20 years old and I'm a Middlebury College student. And I'm also co-manager of the student-run Sunday night environmental group here. I spent most of my life between Western Massachusetts and Southern Vermont, and I'm deeply invested in the future of Vermont's renewable energy standard. Like many of my peers, I envision establishing my adult life and community in this state, raising a family here and working here. And I want the Vermont that I build my life in and the resources I and my community depend on to be truly sustainable. Amending our renewable energy standard to be based around wind and solar, not large hydro, and not allow for exporting of harmful energy production to other communities or greenwashing with renewable energy credits is an essential step to that future. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Lillian Prime.
Hi, my name is Lillian, and I am also a Middlebury College student. I am here today to express my support for Vermont moving to 100% renewable energy that comes from new wind, solar, and storage, and not old resources like large hydro. In this shift, it is crucial to center environmental justice in order to ensure a sustainable and just future. I hope to see the prioritization of electricity sources that don't export harms of energy production to other communities and instead actually reduce our carbon emissions. Again, this means wind and solar rather than large hydro. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And next up, Stephanie DiBattito. Okay, so we'll come back and see if she reconnects. Next will be Nola Parker.
Doesn't seem to be on either.
Okay, next on the list is Kathy Byer.
Good morning and thank you. I am Kathy Byer, work for Evernorth, and I think many of you are familiar with the work of Evernorth in building affordable rental housing across the state of Vermont. 2 years ago, I convened an energy, justice, and housing working group with the purpose of finding avenues for the state to implement the energy equity section of the state's comprehensive energy plan. And in the case of solar, I think it's fair to say that historically the benefits of solar have been concentrated in the higher income single family homeowners and we have not found a way to meaningfully connect solar to our low and moderate income households and especially to renters. This is happening at a time when state energy policy is driving Evernorth and our nonprofit partners to electrify our buildings with heat pumps. And for the right reasons, we are electrifying our buildings for the purpose of climate change, but we are also doing it during a housing crisis. And these buildings must be paired with solar. For a single family home, the solution is straightforward. Panels on the roof can offset most of the electric load of that home. For a multifamily building, this is not the case for a simple reason. The rooftop simply does not have enough room for the panels. In a typical multifamily building, a rooftop array can only offset 20% of the building's electric load. Therefore, I am asking today for the group to consider legislative language which would change the definition of preferred sites in the net metering rule to include 500 kilowatt systems that are net metered to LMI households, and to also consider raising the cap. You may be asking if this is relevant to your discussion on the res update work. I would ask, what are you doing in your work that is truly addressing the inequity of connecting the benefits of solar to our LMI households and especially to our renters? We are aware of the ongoing debate about the potential cost shift of net meter systems to ratepayers, but in having that discussion, again, I urge you to think about how we are ensuring equal access to solar PV for LMI homeowners and renters. Thank you so much for your time.
Next up is Heather Buckner.
Hi, thank you so much for your time. My name is Heather Buckner. I'm a resident of Tunbridge, and I also represent Families Rise Up, a network of over 700 Vermont parents who are concerned about climate change and worried about the future for our children. I'm a mother of a 4-year-old named Luna and a 1-year-old Dylan, and every day I worry about what kind of worlds they're going to inherit. As you're tasked with this huge responsibility of creating a new renewable energy standard for our state, I am asking you to take the future of our children seriously. And what this means is moving Vermont to a 100% renewable energy future without delay that prioritizes and incentivizes development of new local wind, solar, and networked geothermal. It means ending the practice of using Hydro-Quebec renewable energy credits to offset fossil fuel use. The climate doesn't care about false solutions like REC trading to meet goals. It means prohibiting new large hydro to meet renewable energy goals, and it means taking into account the negative impact of dirty energy on communities and ecosystems beyond our borders. We'll be following this progress of this legislation closely. I thank you very much for your time and for taking our children into consideration while making this decision.
Thank you. Next up is Netta Mae Walsh.
She's there.
So Netta Mae, we can't hear you yet. All right, so in case it's a technical issue, we'll go on and come back to you at the end. Next then is Daniel Oroby.
He's not locked on.
Okay. BB Potter. Let's see.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to comment on this topic. My name is BB Potter and I live in St. Albans. I make it short. I just really support 100% renewable energy standard for Vermont. Vermont has to focus on getting our power from new, clean renewable resources, solar, wind, and geothermal. We need to not continue to play the shell game with the RECs for Hydro-Quebec, et cetera. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Back to Netta May.
Hi, sorry about that. I'm here with my kids. So my name is Netta Mae Walsh, and I live in Plainfield, Vermont, right on the Marshfield-Plainfield border. I have two kids. Hazel Rue is here, and my 9-month-old Rowan is here as well. And I'm here because as a parent, I really echo a lot of what has already been said. I really care about the future of our planet and what I am allowing our kids to inherit. And so it feels important to speak up for 100% renewable energy sources. So I support Vermont moving to 100% renewable energy future that comes from new wind and solar and storage and not old resources like large hydro. So this is energy sources that prioritize and incentivize in-state low emissions and renewables, including local community energy projects, and makes this power accessible to low and moderate income Vermonters, ends the practice of using Hydro-Quebec renewable energy credits to offset Vermont's use of fossil fuels, prohibits additional large hydropower to be used to meet new renewable energy goals, and does not export the negative impact of dirty energy to communities and ecosystems beyond our borders. Yeah, thanks so much for I apologize that I wasn't able to speak up right away, but I'm glad to be here and to have my voice be heard. So thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. And batting cleanup, Annette Smith.
Hello, Annette Smith, Vermonters for a Clean Environment. I have a couple comments on what I heard today. I am concerned that I am not hearing any discussion about the societal and environmental costs of sort of a blanket increase in in-state renewables. I have said this before, but I feel it's important to point out, because especially since you have all these environmental groups on the committee, but nobody's talking about the environment. It saddens me to hear people who really probably have no experience with industrial wind development promoting new wind. If you want a current picture of how disruptive it is to communities, look at what's happening in Stamford, Vermont, with a 2.2 megawatt standard offer industrial wind turbine proposed, way too close to where a lot of people live. The environmental effects there, a mile-long new road. I mean, we can't just have a renewable energy standard that says more without looking at the process by which we get there and the effects that it has. On net metering, we are still seeing too much virtual net metering, 500 kilowatt projects built far from load. That's not what was intended. And the one thing that I haven't heard any discussion about, maybe I've missed it, is standard offer. The program is now over. I don't know if there's any plan to bring it back, but I would like to hear that discussed to find out. It has been problematic, and I think that things need to change if it is coming back. Thank you very much for hearing my comments.
Thank you. That completes public comment for this morning.
Next steps. So, meetings and summaries, it'll be the agenda with timestamps to the different conversations you've had today. That will be posted on or before November 3rd. The next meeting for this group is scheduled for November 15th, same time, 8:30 to noon, but it will be entirely virtual. So that's a shift. For all working group members, I just want to make note that this meeting is largely dedicated to the tasks that are relevant to the Brattle Group's analysis. So that would be tasks 6, 7, and 8 as laid out in the Act 33. If there are things that you're hoping to cover or see on the agenda, please be in touch with the co-chairs and know that that's sort of the dedicated time you have with Brattle Group. So work with them will probably take priority. But please do be in touch if you have other things you'd like to see on the agenda. Requested actions between now and then to be determined, but likely it will include a survey exercise that asks for the questions you have for Brattle Group, the kinds of data and information you want to see come out of the analysis, because you'll have people here who are able to talk about it and unpack it with you. They will, I suspect they'll have a presentation of takeaways, but then ample time for Q&A to follow those questions. The anticipated agenda for November 15th, we've talked about it generally, but the concrete agenda will be posted on or before November 13th. Am I forgetting anything for next steps? Okay, I think we're adjourned.
I think we're going to be busy.
Yes.
Yeah. With that, thank you, everyone, and we are adjourned for today. See you virtually on the 15th.